What if the silence of a single species told you more about humanity's fate than the collective wisdom of 200 civilizations that had watched us for millennia? I did not join the Interstellar Diplomatic Corps because I believed in extraterrestrial life. I joined because I was empty enough to accept an assignment no one else would take. Because when you have lost everything that tethers you to certainty, when grief has hollowed you out so completely that you no longer care about the shape of truth, you become useful to institutions that traffic in the impossible. They do not want believers. They want witnesses who have already been broken. My name is Dr. Sarah Chen. For 11 years, I served as a xenolinguistic liaison at a facility that does not appear on any map, conducting interviews with representatives from civilizations we are not supposed to know exist. I have sat across from beings whose biology defied every assumption I was trained to hold sacred. I have translated concepts that have no equivalent in human language. I have asked questions on behalf of a species that does not yet know it is being evaluated. And in all that time, across 200 first contact protocols, only one species refused to answer a single question, not because they were hostile, not because they lacked the capacity for communication, but because the question I asked, the same question I asked every species, the question that was literally printed on the intake form in 17 languages, was about Earth's future. Their refusal is why I am no longer with the Corps. It is why I sleep 3 hours a night. And it is why I am telling you this now, despite the consequences I know are coming, because their silence was not evasion, it was mercy. The facility where I worked was designated Installation Raphael. It existed in a state of architectural contradiction, part embassy, part laboratory, part cathedral. Built into the side of a mountain in a location I cannot disclose, its outer structure suggested a geothermal research station. 14 levels descended into bedrock. Only 3 were accessible without clearance I did not possess until my 8th year there. I was recruited in 2031, 6 months after my husband died in an accident that was not an accident, though I would not learn that distinction until much later. The recruiters found me in a university library at 2 in the morning, still pretending to work on a linguistics paper I would never finish. They did not offer condolences. They offered a job description so vague it could have meant anything. Cross-cultural communication specialist for a government contract requiring extended isolation and psychological flexibility. I said yes before they finished the sentence. Not because I was brave, because I no longer had a reason to stay in a world that made sense. The first 18 months were orientation. They did not call it that. They called it perceptual recalibration. We were shown evidence, not arguments or theories, evidence, footage of craft that moved in ways that violated every principle of propulsion I understood, biological samples that could not exist according to the taxonomic frameworks we had spent centuries constructing, audio recordings of languages that operated on syntactic principles human vocal anatomy could not reproduce. But what convinced me, what convinced all of us, was not the evidence itself. It was the institutional calm surrounding it. The way the handlers discussed these impossibilities with the same bureaucratic fatigue as someone processing insurance claims. The forms, the protocols, the casual mention of Species 47 or the collective envoy in the same tone you would use to reference a difficult client. No one gasps at miracles after filling out the paperwork for them 14 times. The interview process was standardized. It had to be. When you are attempting diplomatic exchange with civilizations whose biology, psychology, and temporal perception operate on fundamentally different principles, standardization is not bureaucracy, it is survival. Each interview followed the same structure. I would receive a briefing packet 48 hours in advance, species designation, known communication modalities, cultural context where available, technological classification, threat assessment, and always, at the bottom of page 7, a single line, reason for contact, ongoing observation of Sol 3 development. Sol 3, that is what they called Earth. Not in their languages, I will come to that, but in the translated designation files. Clinical, neutral, the way you would label a petri dish. The interview room was in sublevel 7, 15 meters by 15 meters. Walls composed of a material that absorbed rather than reflected light, giving the space a quality of depth that was subtly wrong. temperature controlled to exactly 20.5 degrees Celsius, humidity at 45%, 2 chairs that could reconfigure based on the physiology of the visitor, a table between us made of something that looked like obsidian but was not stone, no recording devices. This was emphasized in every briefing. The interviews were not recorded because, and I quote from the orientation manual, certain forms of observation constitute interference in ways current theoretical frameworks cannot adequately predict. Instead, I took notes, handwritten, in a language I had to learn specifically for this purpose, designed to be untranslatable by conventional means. My reports were read by 3 people, then destroyed. The knowledge remained only in the pattern of my memory and in whatever databases existed in levels I never accessed. The questions I asked were the same for every species. They were provided by analysis, refined over decades of contact. 37 questions in total, ranging from the basic to the existential. How does your species understand the concept of time? What is your civilization's relationship to mortality? What brought you to observe humanity? What patterns do you recognize in human development? And question 33, the one that mattered. Based on your observations, what can you tell us about Earth's trajectory? For 11 years, I asked that question 200 times. 199 species answered. 1 did not. Before I tell you about the species that refused, you need to understand what the others said. Because their consistency was more unsettling than any single revelation could have been. The answers varied in specificity and philosophical framework, but the underlying pattern was identical. Humanity was at what they called a deterministic threshold, a point in a civilization's development where the range of possible futures collapses from infinite to finite, and then from finite to singular. Species 12, a collective intelligence that existed as a distributed network of smaller organisms, described it as the moment when a fire decides whether to spread or consume itself. Species 78, beings who perceived time non-linearly and communicated through controlled manipulation of local gravity fields, showed me, not told me, showed me through a sensation I still cannot adequately describe, a vision of a river approaching a waterfall. The river does not choose the waterfall. The waterfall is simply what happens to rivers that follow certain paths. Species 134, who looked disturbingly human except for the fact that their blood was silicon-based and they communicated by altering the chemical composition of the air between us, put it most simply, you are about to become what you have always been becoming. The question is not whether this happens. The question is whether you recognize it. I asked what they meant by it. They said recognition itself was the variable. Not all the species were pessimistic. 17 suggested that humanity had potential pathways toward what they called integration, joining some kind of larger community of conscious civilizations. But even these optimistic assessments came with qualifications. We would need to achieve certain technological milestones. We would need to survive our own destructive tendencies long enough to mature beyond them. We would need to develop forms of cooperation that our current social structures made nearly impossible. 6 species told me directly that they were studying us for historical purposes, not because they wanted to help, but because they wanted to understand the specific failure mode of a species that develops technology faster than wisdom. They were cataloging us the way you would catalog an extinction event, but they all answered. They told me what they saw. They offered perspectives, frameworks, warnings, hopes. They engaged with the question of our future because, for them, our future was simply another form of data. Interesting data, perhaps tragic data, but ultimately just information to be observed and recorded, except for species 162. The briefing packet for species 162 was different from the first page. Normally, the packets were comprehensive, 20 to 40 pages of context. This one was 7 pages, and 5 of them were redacted. What remained told me almost nothing. Species designation, 162. Communication modality, direct conceptual transfer. Physiology, redacted. Technology, level, redacted. First contact date, redacted. Number of previous interviews, 0. Reason for contact, requested specifically to meet with xenolinguistic liaison. Additional notes. This species has declined all previous interview requests. Their willingness to meet now is significant, but unexplained. Exercise extreme caution with question 33. That last line stayed with me. In 11 years, I had never seen a warning attached to a specific question. The questions themselves were considered benign, philosophical inquiries designed to build understanding. Why would one of them require caution? I asked my handler. Her name was Director Voss, a woman in her 60s who had overseen the interview program since its inception. She looked at me for a long moment before answering. Because they are the only species who has been here since the beginning, she said. Not the beginning of the program, the beginning of us, and they have never once offered an opinion about what they have seen. I did not understand. I asked her to clarify. They have been observing Earth for 67,000 years, she said, continuously, without interruption. Every other species we have contact with arrived within the last 500 to 5,000 years. Species 162 was here before we built cities, before we developed agriculture, before we had language as we understand it. They have watched us longer than we have watched ourselves, and in all that time, they have never commented on what they think we are becoming. She paused. Until 3 weeks ago, when they requested this meeting, they asked for you by name. I entered the interview room at 600 on a Thursday in March. The air felt different before I even saw them, heavier, as though the space itself was holding its breath. Species 162 was already there. I will not describe their appearance in detail, not because I am forbidden to, but because human language fails at the threshold of their form. They were not large. They were not small. They occupied space in a way that suggested space itself was negotiable. Their surface, if surface is the right word, seemed to shift between states of matter as though solidity was a choice rather than a condition. But what struck me most was their stillness. Every other species I had interviewed moved. Even the ones who communicated through pure thought displayed some form of physical animation, a ripple, a shift in luminosity, a redistribution of mass. Species 162 was so perfectly still that for a moment I thought I was looking at a statue. Then they spoke, not in sound, not even in thought as I had experienced it with telepathic species. They spoke in certainty, a direct transmission of meaning that bypassed language entirely and arrived in my mind as knowledge I suddenly possessed without having learned it. You are the one who asks about futures. It was not a question, it was a statement of fact, delivered with the weight of observation that had no emotional coloring. I sat down across from them and opened my notebook. Yes, I said aloud, I ask every species about what they observe regarding Earth's trajectory. I hope you are willing to share your perspective. There was a pause, not hesitation, something else. A gap in the transmission where something was being withheld, considered. I could not tell. We have never shared this perspective. I know, I said. Director Voss told me you have declined all previous interview requests. May I ask why you agreed to meet with me now? Because you are ready to hear silence. I did not understand what that meant. I told them so. You will. We proceeded through the standard questions. Species 162 answered each one with a precision that felt less like communication and more like revelation. They did not speculate. They did not interpret. They simply transmitted facts as they understood them, and those facts rearranged my understanding of reality with each response. When I asked how they understood time, they showed me, not in words, not in images, but in direct experiential knowledge, that time was not linear. It was not even multidirectional. It was a field of probability that consciousness moved through, and what we called the past was simply the region of that field where probability had collapsed into singularity. The future existed in the same way, but we could not perceive it because we were still inside the collapse. When I asked about their relationship to mortality, they conveyed a concept that translated roughly as, we do not end because we do not distinguish between existing and having existed. Your species will understand this eventually. It is one of the few certainties. When I asked what brought them to observe humanity, they said, we do not observe you, we witness you. Observation implies distance. We are here. We have always been here. Not to study, but to remain present during your becoming. I asked what we were becoming. They did not answer directly. Instead, they said, every conscious species reaches a moment when it must choose between what it is and what it believes itself to be. The gap between these two states is where transformation occurs. You are inside that gap now. I wrote this down as carefully as I could, though I knew the words were insufficient containers for what was being transmitted. I could feel the other interviews in my memory beginning to reorganize themselves around this new framework. All those species, all those perspectives, They had been describing the same phenomenon from different angles, but species 162 was describing it from inside, from the position of something that had seen this gap before, in other species, across timescales I could not fathom. I continued through the questions. They answered each one. Their responses were dense, layered, requiring a cognitive effort that left me exhausted, even though we were only 40 minutes into the interview. But they were cooperating. They were engaged. They were sharing. And then I reached question 33. I remember the exact wording. I had asked it 199 times before. I knew it by heart. Based on your observations of human development and behavior, what can you tell us about Earth's trajectory? Where do you see humanity in 50 years? In 500? What future do you perceive for our species? The silence that followed was different from any silence I had experienced in that room. It was not absence. It was presence made of withheld speech. I could feel the answer they were not giving me, the way you can feel the weight of a heavy object behind a locked door. We cannot answer this question. Cannot or will not, I asked. Both. They are the same. I don't understand, I said. You have watched us for 67,000 years. You must have some perspective on where we are heading. Yes. Then why won't you share it? Because the answer would prevent the possibility of the answer being different. I stared at my notebook. The words I had just written made no sense. I asked them to clarify. If we tell you what we see, you will move toward it or away from it. Either movement confirms it. The trajectory becomes fixed. By describing your future, we create it. But the other species answered this question, I said. They gave predictions, frameworks, assessments. Why are you different? They have been watching for centuries or millennia. Their observations are incomplete. They see patterns, but they do not see the pattern beneath the pattern. They can tell you what you are doing without changing what you are becoming. And you cannot? We have been here too long. Our perspective is too complete. If we speak what we see, the observation ceases to be neutral. It becomes intervention. I felt something cold move through my chest. A sensation that was not quite fear, but shared its geography. Are you saying that your answer would guarantee a specific future? We are saying that your species is at a point where knowledge of the future is itself the variable that determines the future. What you do not know preserves possibility. What you know collapses it. I sat with that for a long time. The air in the room seemed to thicken. Finally, I asked the question that was forming underneath all the others. Is what you see bad? That question assumes the categories good and bad remain meaningful in the context of what you are becoming. They do not. Then what categories are meaningful? Necessary, inevitable, already occurring. I should have stopped there. Protocol dictated that if a species declined to answer a question, I was to note the refusal and move to the next item. But I could not move forward, because their refusal was not like the refusals I had encountered before. Species 89 had declined to answer a question about their military capabilities because it violated their cultural taboos around discussing violence. Species 112 had declined to answer a question about their reproductive biology because the concept of biological reproduction did not apply to their form of existence. Those refusals were boundaries, limits on what they were willing or able to share. This refusal was different. Species 162 was not protecting themselves. They were protecting us, from knowledge, from certainty, from the future they could see but would not name. You said you came to this meeting because I was ready to hear silence, I said. What did you mean? You have lost enough to understand that not all answers are merciful. You know what it is to carry knowledge that destroys the person who holds it. You have been broken by certainty before. That is why we can trust you with this refusal. They were right. I did understand. In the year after my husband died, I had learned his death was not random, that he had been killed because he had discovered something about the work I now did, though I still do not know the specifics. Knowing that transformed my grief from tragedy into mission. It gave me something to do with the void inside me, but it also destroyed any possibility of healing into someone who could be at peace with loss. The knowledge had fixed my future into a shape I could not escape. You are telling me that not knowing humanity's future is a gift, I said. We are telling you that uncertainty is the only space in which choice remains real. But people need hope, I said. They need to know if there is a future worth working toward. What they need and what they ask for are not the same. Hope that depends on certainty is not hope. It is delayed despair. True hope exists only in the absence of guaranteed outcomes. I felt something shift in my understanding. Not agreement, but recognition. They were not being cruel. They were being precise. By refusing to answer, they were preserving something that would be destroyed by the answer. Not the future itself, but our relationship to it. The other species told me what they saw, I said. Were they wrong to do that? They told you what they believe they see. Their belief is incomplete enough to be safely shared. They do not see the shape clearly enough to trap you inside it. And you do. Yes. Then this is mercy. Yes. We sat in silence for a time that I cannot measure. The room felt different, smaller, as though the weight of what was not being said was displacing the physical space around us. Finally, I asked, "What should I do with this refusal? How do I report that you declined to answer?" "You report exactly what occurred. You tell them we see clearly. You tell them we chose silence. You do not speculate about why. They will want to know why. They will. And you will tell them that the why cannot be separated from the what. That to explain our refusal would be to give the answer we are refusing to give." I wrote this down. My hand was shaking slightly, not from fear, from the cognitive strain of holding multiple incompatible truths simultaneously. "Is there anything else you can tell me?" I asked. "Anything that would not collapse the future into certainty?" They were quiet for a long moment. Then, "You are asking the wrong question." "What is the right question?" "You already know. You have been asking it in every interview. You ask, what will happen to us? When the question is, what are we willing to become? The future is not a destination you arrive at. It is not something that happens to you. It is what you are actively becoming in every moment of non-knowledge. Your species stands at a threshold where you must choose between being told what you are and discovering what you are. We will not take that choice from you by speaking the answer. Even if the answer could save us, especially then, because salvation that comes from external certainty is not salvation. It is surrender. I understood, or I thought I did. They were telling me that the refusal was itself the answer, that the fact they would not speak meant something more important than anything they could say. "How many species have you watched reach this threshold?" I asked. "All of them." "And how many survived it?" "Survival is not the variable that matters." "Then what is? Whether they remained themselves through the transformation, whether they chose consciously or were chosen by circumstance, whether they became what they feared or what they could not yet imagine." The interview ended not because we ran out of questions, but because I could feel myself approaching a cognitive limit. The transmission of pure concept, unfiltered by language, was physically exhausting. My head was pounding. My vision had started to blur at the edges. Species 162 seemed to recognize this. They said, "You have what you came for, not the answer you wanted, the answer you needed." "I don't feel like I have any answers," I said. "Exactly." They rose, though rose is not the right word, because they did not move upward so much as become untethered from the position they had occupied. They moved toward the door without walking, and then they stopped, turned. Not physically, but in some other way that I felt as a shift in attention. "One more thing." "Yes?" "You will be asked to resign because of this report. You will be told that our refusal represents a failure on your part. This is not true. You succeeded, not at extracting information, but at receiving the only truth we could give. When they ask you why we would not answer, do not apologize for our silence. Do not try to convince them that you tried hard enough. Simply tell them what we told you, that some questions are answered by their refusal to be answered. And when you leave this place, as you will, do not carry our silence as despair. Carry it as space. Space that you and your species must fill with choosing." Then they were gone. Not departed. Gone. The room was empty in a way that felt final. I sat there for 20 minutes before I could stand. When I finally made it back to my quarters, I wrote the report in one sitting. 12 pages. I did not editorialize. I did not interpret. I simply recorded what had been transmitted. I submitted it at 0300. By 0800, I was summoned to Director Voss's office. Director Voss read the report while I sat across from her. She did not look up until she had finished all 12 pages. When she did, her expression was carefully neutral. "This is problematic," she said. I reported exactly what occurred. "I know. That is what makes it problematic." She set the report down. "Do you understand what you have given us? Or rather, what you have not given us?" They refused to answer question 33. I documented the refusal and their reasoning. "Their reasoning is a non-answer that sounds like philosophy," she said. "The people who fund this program do not pay for philosophy. They pay for intelligence, actionable assessments, data that can inform policy and strategic planning." "Then they should have interviewed one of the other 199 species," I said. "Species 162 gave us the only answer they could give without violating their understanding of how observation affects outcome. Or they gave you nothing and dressed it up in mystical language to make you think it was profound." I had expected this response, but hearing it still felt like a small violence. "With respect, Director, I have conducted interviews with telepathic species, beings who exist in non-linear time, and collectives that share consciousness across planetary distances. I know the difference between genuine conceptual complexity and evasion. Species 162 was not evading. They were being precise. About nothing. About the cost of certainty." Voss leaned back in her chair. "You have been with this program for 11 years. You have given us valuable intelligence from 200 contact events. Your work has been exemplary. But this," she tapped the report, "this reads like you have been compromised." "Compromised by what?" "By the very thing they did, by making you believe that their refusal is itself meaningful, that silence is data." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Because she was not wrong to be suspicious. Every intelligence protocol I had been trained in warned against accepting non-answers as answers, against allowing subjects to control the narrative by withholding information and then claiming the withholding itself was the information. But this was different. I knew it was different, and I could not prove it. "What do you want me to do?" I asked. "I want you to go back," she said. "Request another interview. Tell them that we need actionable intelligence, not philosophical frameworks. Tell them that their refusal is not acceptable. They will not change their position." "How do you know?" "Because their position is not based on unwillingness. It is based on a temporal and causal understanding that makes answering the question equivalent to creating the outcome. They cannot answer without violating their own ethical framework. Then we will find another species who can answer. Someone who has observed us long enough to have meaningful perspective, but not so long that they believe their observation affects our trajectory." I understood what she was really saying. "You failed to extract the information we needed, so we will find someone else who can do your job." "I would like to submit my resignation," I said. She looked genuinely surprised. "That is not necessary." "Yes, it is, because if I stay, you will ask me to compromise something I cannot compromise. You will ask me to treat their refusal as a problem to be solved rather than as the answer itself, and I cannot do that, not because I am being stubborn, but because I finally understand what this program is really measuring. And what is that? Whether we are mature enough to accept that some questions are more dangerous than the uncertainty they generate. I left Installation Raphael 3 days later. My clearance was revoked. My memory of classified details was suppressed through a process I cannot fully recall. But the core of the encounter remained. They could not take that from me without taking the person I had become. In the 18 months since, I have thought about species 162 every day. Not their appearance, which is already fading from my memory, but the weight of their silence, the gift of their refusal. I have come to understand several things. First, the other 199 species told us what they saw because they did not see clearly enough to understand that telling us would trap us. Their perspectives were incomplete, and that incompleteness made them safe to share. They could warn us, guide us, offer frameworks, precisely because they were still guessing. Species 162 was not guessing. Second, the program itself was based on a flawed premise. We assumed that gathering more data would give us more control over our future. But what if the opposite is true? What if too much certainty about where we are heading removes the very thing that allows us to change direction? Species 162 understood this. We did not. Third, their refusal was not about protecting classified information. It was about protecting our agency. By not telling us what they saw, they preserved our capacity to choose. The moment they spoke our future, that future would become fixed, not because prediction is powerful, but because knowledge of the prediction would reshape every choice we made in response to it. And fourth, this is not a story about aliens. It is a story about consciousness at a threshold, about civilizations that develop the capacity to know their own future before they develop the wisdom to understand why that knowledge might be the most dangerous thing they could possess. Species 162 gave us silence because silence was the only gift that kept the future open. I do not know if humanity will survive the next century. I do not know if we will transform into something unrecognizable or collapse under the weight of our own contradictions. I do not know if the threshold we are approaching leads to integration with a larger cosmic community or to some other outcome that does not fit into categories like survival and extinction. But I do know this: we are inside the gap between what we are and what we believe ourselves to be. And that gap is not a problem to be solved. It is the space where transformation becomes possible. The 200 species I interviewed all had perspectives on our future. Some hopeful, some pessimistic, all incomplete, but only one species, the one that had watched us the longest, that understood us the most completely, refused to tell us what they saw. Not because they do not care, because they care enough to let us choose. I think about that often. In a world obsessed with prediction, optimization, and control, what does it mean that the beings with the clearest vision of our future consider it an act of mercy to remain silent? I think it means we are not as trapped as we believe, that the future is not a fixed destination we are hurtling toward, but a field of possibility we are actively collapsing through our choices. And that as long as we do not know with certainty what we are becoming, we retain the capacity to become something we cannot yet imagine. Species 162 gave us uncertainty, not as punishment, but as gift, because uncertainty is the only condition under which hope remains possible, the only space in which transformation is real. I have told you what happened in that room. I have given you the refusal I received, and now I am doing what species 162 did. I am giving you a question without an answer. What if the future you fear is not inevitable? What if the future you hope for is not impossible? What if the only thing preventing either outcome is your certainty about which one is coming? I cannot tell you what species 162 saw when they looked at humanity's trajectory. I cannot tell you because they would not tell me, and I understand now why that refusal was the most honest thing they could offer. But I can tell you this: we are not finished. We are not determined. We are not trapped inside a story that has already been written. We are standing in the gap, and what we do in this gap, the choices we make in the absence of guaranteed outcomes, is what writes the story forward. Species 162 has been watching us for 67,000 years. They have seen us build and destroy, create and consume, reach toward the stars, and retreat into ourselves. And after all that observation, they chose not to tell us where we are heading. That alone should tell you something, not about our destination, but about the fact that our destination is still being decided. I do not know what you will do with this information. I do not know if it will change anything for you, but I know that I had to share it, because silence about their silence would be a betrayal of the gift they gave. So I am giving it to you now: the refusal, the uncertainty, the terrifying, liberating possibility that we are not yet what we will become. What you do with that is your choice, and that is the whole point. If you made it this far, thank you for witnessing. Drop a comment below and tell me where you are watching from, and whether you would want to know the answer if it was offered to you. Because maybe the question is not what species 162 saw. Maybe the question is what we are willing to become while we still do not know.